So next up we have Kumar Reddy, who's the Director of Technical Marketing at Cisco. He says he has a Cisco tattoo, but I don't know if he's willing to show it or not. So, all right. Kumar, thanks a bunch.
Thanks a lot. Hello, everybody. So I'm going to cover a couple of different deployment experiences that we have at Cisco. I want to thank some of the people who are in the audience, so Mayur, Andrew, and John, who have provided a lot of data and done a lot of the work here. And I'm going to break it down into two different parts. The first part is to talk about our standard rollout within the company and how we're doing that and what we're doing. And the second, which I think for a V6 audience might be fun, is to talk about some experiments we're doing or we have done recently with quite large networks and public networks doing V6 only. Right? I was interested to hear previous speakers talk about their plans for V6 only. And I think as an industry, we have some work to do in that domain, and so we'll share some of our data. So first on the internal rollout or the standard enterprise network rollout, we break the problem into two different paths. Right? If you're looking at V6 adoption, as many of the previous speakers have said, you basically go from the outside to the inside. Right? So you convert all your public-facing properties, be it HTTP, mail, DNS, and so forth, to be V6 enabled, and you work in. We have slightly more anecdotal data than was shared at the start of the presentation, but based on our interaction with customers, we think 65, 75%-ish, right, to give you an idea of the scientific exactitude of that number, will go this route. And the main driver for this, there were lots of examples shared, but the main driver is really business continuity, right? Mobile providers, especially around the world, are going to be lighting up V6 only eyeballs. These eyeballs need to go and see something. They need to see content, right? They need to be able to buy things. So the main driver from an enterprise point of view, the predominant deployment, we think, and others think, will be outside in, okay? And that's very much centered around data centers. From a technical point of view, it often involves some form of translation layer that you're going to front end your existing content, right, to buy yourself more time. And it's a well-trod path. The second option is to work from the inside out. And that takes the internal network that you have. You start to deploy V6, and you have, again, two permutations. You can either deploy from the core, which is easier, right, because it's the part of the network that the networking guys manage the most, and move out to the clients. Or, harder, you can start from the clients and move in. And if you do that last piece, it tends to be an insurrection that's happening on your network, right, because your users are trying to deploy V6 despite you. Right? So we'd advise, and what we do, is when you're doing from the inside out, start from the networking pieces and move forward. So where are we? The thing that I cannot emphasize enough that's been shared a couple of times here is the importance of executive support and buy-in at multiple levels of a company, right? And we're no exception. So the main drivers that Cisco has for doing V6 are a little unusual, right? We have the classic business driver of wanting to be able to allow our customers who will be using V6 only or using V6 in other parts of the world access to our gear and our websites, okay? We also have the standard driver of expecting one day to be opening sites in parts of the world that have no V4, or more likely, more expensive V4, all right? So we want to be ready for that from an operational point of view. Second category, and this is a little unusual in most cases, but not here, we want to be able to use V6 and allow our engineering teams to use V6 so they can continue development, right? That's the main driver for internal. And when you look at what it takes to deploy, this came up earlier as well, v6 starts off as a networking problem. All right, the networking people understand the issue, but the solution really has to bring in people from application teams, security teams, support teams, all walks of life, right? There's a lot of buzz, there's a lot of enthusiasm to do this, but if you try and deploy v6 at any form of scale as a networking-only problem, it's going to be tough, right? Second, to go back to the executive support or the management support, it has to be multiple layers and in multiple places, right? You need to have your security team buying in because for a little while, they're going to be nervous, right? Anxious. So you want them to calm, you want them to be calm, and to help that, you need the buy-in from their management chain. You're going to need support from, obviously, the IT organization, who will be doing the brunt of this. You're going to need, in our case, support from the engineering teams because things need fixing, things need changing. You need support from the sales team, everybody, as far and as broad as possible, helps you drive deployment successfully. Now, one thing that we're doing that is a little odd is we're deploying outside in and inside out in parallel. All right? We have multiple parallel sets of reasons to do that. And the approach that we have is pretty much classic. We have a translation layer that's being used in our internet presence sites to serve v6 content or existing content to v6 clients. Internally, we started with our core network, which is 100% dual stacked. And there was a joke earlier about using dual stack where you can and tunnel where you must. That's what we're doing. All right? So we use dual stack as much as we can, as far as we can. We have used tunnels. And the reason we've used tunnels is to allow for v6 access in parts of the world where we don't yet have dual stacked offices. All right? So this is classic over-the-top v6 tunneling on v4 infrastructure. The other thing that we've done, or we've seen, is we've seen some interesting, you're familiar, I'm sure, with the Happy Eyeballs RFC 6555, which determines how endpoints choose if they have v6 access and v4 access simultaneously, and how they will use v6 preferentially in certain situations, unless the endpoint measures a degradation in response time or latency, in which case it'll flip to v4. Okay? So we've seen that in action. As you enable v6 connectivity around the world, typically you'll have one POP that will start, will be a major v6 POP. You'll spread it to other parts of the world. And you'll have clients internally who have v6 access. They're in a dual stacked office, and they're going to try and reach the v6 internet, and they don't. Right? It's not a question of they can't. It's just the time it takes to follow the path for the v6 address family is long enough that the client or the browser will prefer v4. Okay? So you experience all these fun permutations of things that you think should happen, don't, and then you've got to go and figure out why exactly it happened. Okay? One website that you might like to play with, and it has a fun v6 address if you care to have a look, that we've stood up is called 6lab. And there we're trying to help people follow and track who is deploying what where, right? Worldwide, what sort of transit capabilities are there? What sort of ISP capabilities are there? What user capabilities are there? And also what website capabilities are there? And so you can see, as was said earlier, that the primary footprint for v6 capabilities today is in Western and Northern Europe. The US, as of recently, is a fairly significant penetration rate. And the areas where you'd expect to see a lot of v6 capability because they got the least number of v4 addresses are still lagging, right? I suspect this will change in a non-linear fashion in the not too distant future. Okay. The other thing that we experience as you turn on dual stack is some things change, right? I'll talk a bit more about the details of this in a second, but obviously address allocation mechanisms change. The standard routing topologies classically don't change, but security plane needs change and the management plane needs changes. So I thought I'd bring two examples of management plane, because in the networking business, oftentimes that gets dusted under the rug a little bit. So I just give two simple examples of things that you will need to think about as you're bringing on dual stack capabilities. One is an extremely simple and obvious one, but the standard MIBs make it a little harder than you might think, which is to have the capability to report to your food chain about how much V6 is there on the network. And you should be able to classify V4 traffic, V6 traffic, and report on how much dual stack there is, how much V6 there is, how much V4 there still is. We typically use NetFlow to do this, but there are other mechanisms as well. And the second example, which is readable if you try really hard, is the need to deduplicate your addresses, right? So as you all know here, your endpoints, when they run Slack, will use privacy addresses, right? The major OSs have different behaviors for when they generate a privacy address and for how long they'll hold it. But when you're looking in standard reporting tools and you're trying to see how many hosts there are on your network, and you're trying to correlate IP addresses to device or to MAC, which is something that we do a lot, remember your endpoints now have many IP addresses, not just one, right? And in this case, you have a link local, you have a global, and you have two privacy addresses for MAC, all right? So just a couple of things that we experience that seem perhaps obvious, but are indicative of the sort of changes to operations that people are going to need to make. Some are big, as were referred to earlier on. These are a case of two smaller ones. So the next part of my presentation is going to talk about some experiments we've done with V6 only. So I was very happy to hear earlier on that there is an organization that is going to turn off V4 in a fairly aggressive timeline of 2014. But one thing that my personal, private, non-binding opinion is that we'll see more organizations wanting to do this. Right? Once we get a comfort level with V6, dual stack is great, but the true benefits come when you have V6 only. Right? So what does it look like live, and what can we learn? We've done several experiments internally on our own campus. Usually in semi-public forums like an internal conference like this, where we have a good group of volunteers who are willing to pitch in and help out. We also did one at a rather large network, which was Cisco Live in San Diego, which is about 15,000, 20,000 people on it. The actual core network was completely dual stacked, and all the conference attendees had obviously V6 and V4 addresses. The registration services were fully available over V6, and all of the wireless addressing, management, routing, switching services were also dual stacked. But in a small corner of the conference, we stood up a V6 only SSID, which we didn't advertise very widely because we just wanted to try it. And we told people who had signed up for the V6 sessions that they could use it if they wanted to. Right? So the data, we have a couple of different data points that I think you'll find interesting. One is the overall percentage terms of V6 only users that we had was roughly in line, a little higher than the overall percentage that we see today of V6 traffic on the public internet. Right, a handful of percent overall. Given the opt-in nature of the network, that wasn't very surprising. We were more trying things out than anything else. What was interesting, and for people who are working with any form of BYOD environment, and this is an extreme case of a BYOD environment, was the growth in V6 capability that we observed on endpoints in 6 months. So we have two data points from two different shows, admittedly, but one was at the start of this calendar year at the World IPv6 conference in Paris, where we did the same sort of thing. And the second was in July in San Diego for Cisco Live. And we saw that the devices that were capable of doing dual stack, they had a v4 address, we observed a v6 address for the same MAC, increased from under half to over 3/4, just to use executive math there to keep it simple. All right, so that's a pretty high growth rate. Second, the use of v6 on all SSIDs, be they the dual stack or v6 only, so here we're looking at traffic, live traffic, increased by over 85%. All right, now we didn't do anything special on the network to attract the traffic, we just turned it on. And the one major difference was that the show happened after World IPv6 launch. So the Quad A's were coming through, and it was easier to get v6 traffic if you were correctly configured to do so. All right? So I think that gives a very encouraging idea of the amount of capabilities that are latent in the endpoints. And when you turn on your v6 capabilities, dual stack on your network, you'll expect to see high growth in the traffic. But overall traffic in percentage terms remains quite modest, right? And I'm hoping this is something that's going to change in the not too distant future. So just to zoom a bit on what happens if you turn off v4, okay? So on a wireless network, so the setup is the core continues to be dual stack. For fun, we turned off v4 on the wireless network. The access was again volunteer-based because you had to know there was an SSID or recognize a v6 only SSID and be adventurous enough to try it. Right? So there was a geek selection factor that was applied, but nevertheless, this is interesting. We saw quite a lot of perhaps unexpected dependencies still exist between devices of all types, network and client, on v4. Right? Some mobile devices have relatively recent operating systems that require a v4 address to function. Right? They won't join. To the point that at Cisco Live, we had to hand out a bogus v4 address and filter the traffic so that we could have a pseudo v6 only network, right? Pure v6 only at the time wasn't possible. Second, somewhat unexpectedly, but will change, is not all OSs support DHCP v6, right? This used to be pretty widespread a couple of years ago, but there are still OS builds today going out in recent mobile devices that don't support DHCP v6. So you're going to have to live with Slack if you want to have a fairly broad, an open door policy. Just so you don't think that I'm bashing on the device or the endpoints, what I'm saying about v4 requirements is true of network devices too, mostly for management plane. The other thing we've seen is, just to go through the another interesting point, is the implementation of privacy addressing on two of the major class of desk laptop OSs changes. So for one category of device, you will have a privacy address that's allocated for 24 hours, and the endpoint will iterate every 24 hours to a new privacy address. There's another category of device that will change the privacy address every time the interface flaps. Right? So if you put that back into a conference context where people change SSID or they open and close their laptop a lot or they turn their phone on and off, you'll have a high number of privacy addresses per endpoint that are going to turn up in your CAM tables or whatever it is that you're doing to manage these things. So then you need to start thinking about how long you're going to, how you're going to configure your timers so that you have a sufficiently wide amount of time where you tolerate large addresses per different endpoint. And you'll see that there are interactions between the state machines on the clients and the state machines on the network devices that can mean that you're going to have to play and experiment with your timer settings in order to have a relatively smooth conference type experience. Okay. So that was one surprise. And the other well-reported fact, so it wasn't a surprise, is the happy eyeballs implementations that you find in the OS layer or in the browsers differs, right? So if I zoom out a bit and I try to summarize what do we see from a technical point of view on a v6 network, it reminds me of .1x, right? In the beginnings of .1x, be it on wire to wireless, there was a large amount of variation in behavior that you would find depending on the endpoint, depending on the version of OS, depending on the device type, depending on the network software that you were running. And several speakers talked earlier about the need to test. You need to test these permutations, right? Because you will get surprises at the fringes, and the surprises tend to come up in the form of detail that you can't often think your way to, right? We couldn't have sat down and thought our way to this. We tried it and we found it out. Okay. The other thing is, at a more broad level, is v6 is still at runtime a specialized skill. Right? It's true that when you're looking at doing a design of an IP network, it's IP. We know there are enough differences between v6 and v4. But when stuff hits the fan, people start looking for the v6 expert. Right? That still happens. So from a professional point of view, it's fantastic. You know, great career opportunity for the next couple of years. But if we want to scale this, it needs to go away. Right? v6 really just needs to be another address family for IP. And we should have the same skill sets in network engineers and in our application and security peers to be comfortable dealing with v6, right? And we noticed this especially when it came to troubleshooting, when it came to debugging, when something went wrong, to the previous speaker's point, v6 is fingered and blamed very, very early on in the troubleshooting cycle, right? And you have to be able to explain that, no, it's probably not that. You need the data that I showed earlier to prove what's going on in order to get over this hump. So probably four main takeaways to try to summarize. One is for any form of rollout, you need multi-dimensional support. You need the executives behind you. You don't necessarily have to spend a lot of money, the capital equipment stuff, but you do have to spend a lot of time. And getting people's time requires support, right? Second, there is a ton of enthusiasm to tap into to make this successful, but we need to spread the skill set beyond the enthusiasts in a relatively timely fashion. Third, dual stack works very well, right? You'll notice that when I was talking about the fun stuff that was on the v6 only network, dual stack has been working very well for us. On v6 only, it's a lot of fun, but there's a lot of subtlety going on between what the clients are doing, what the network is doing, what different elements are expecting the other to do. And my main takeaway is there are lots of bugs to fix, and there will be for a while. Okay? That's all I had. Any questions? Yeah, so I'll repeat the question, I guess. The question is, can I speak to how Cisco is going to roll out v6 support across the product lines? So within the engineering team where I actually work, there's a series of mandates to make us ship product and features that support v4 and v6 side by side. So we don't have a date in that we must be done by such and such a date. But we're working out from the networking layer itself up to the applications. And today, at least in the part of the company where I sit, every single feature down to that level of granularity is policed to make sure that we're putting in v6 capability. Yes, sir.
You had a slide up where you were talking about experiences when you went to having a v6 only network, and you were saying that there was problems with disconnects and also long time databases and so on. Or did you figure out what was happening? Was it that was it just the link was unstable? Was it getting the IPv6 addresses? What was the problem?
So the reference to on the slide earlier on was users experience problems in the form of long connection time or disconnection, right? So I was trying to make 2 points. One is the users, by and large, had no clue of the details of v6. They didn't, on the most popular mobile device, if you go to the network configuration pane, you don't see a v6 address. So they didn't know that v6 was playing any role in their life at that particular time. They just saw a sucky network access. From a technical point of view, the issue that we had then was that we had on our network devices that needed v4 but didn't get it. All right, so they try and stop and try and stop and try and stop. We had devices that needed Slack and we didn't always use it. And then third, we had an issue on our network for a while with multicast, which means that RAs weren't being distributed properly, which caused all sorts of fun things to go on. All right, so lunch is the next order of business? Yes. All right, I'm going to hand over to the master of ceremonies for lunch details.